Welcome to Novel Ideas, where we chat with local authors. I'm Carolyn Luck, and I'm here with my co-host, Josh Brogadir.
Carol, great to be with you. As always, our guest this evening is David Driscoll, who serves as the 22nd Commissioner of our State Department of Education. His 45 years in public service, public education, started as a high school math teacher, and he worked his way up to superintendent with a doctorate in education administration from Boston College. And he filled the highest position in education in Massachusetts. Your book is Commitment and Common Sense. It is readable, it is exciting, and that is not often said about an education book. And thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Appreciate it a lot. And you, by the way, are our 22nd guest, which fits in perfectly with the 22nd, obviously, Commissioner of Education. Just to start out with you for a moment, why write this book now?
Well, interestingly enough, I've been writing it for 10 years. I mean, I started a long time ago just thinking that I should record from my perspective what happened. And some of it was people would say, well, this is why we did so well in ed reform, and this is why we did so well in Massachusetts, and it was this issue or that issue. And I realized it was more than that. In fact, it was all of those things, and it was complicated. So I just started to record it. And then friends of mine in other states said, you really should publish a book and talk about the kinds of things you did and share it with other states. And you should share the things that you think they could do as well. So that's it. It kind of evolved in that way.
What kinds of things did you really feel were important to spice up this?
Yeah, well, you started with that. And you said I started as a high school teacher. I actually started as a junior high school math teacher in Somerville. And I think the reason it relates it relates to a lot of people say to me, you brought back so many memories of teaching and the classroom and that kind of thing. And it's a very interesting paradox. There is this illogic to schools. There just is. And in this particular case, it was even worse than usual. They arrange kids according to their ability, 3A through 3I. If you were in 3I, you were so they sorted kids, and sure enough, they live up to their expectations. So there was all this illogic. They had a banking period where a handful of kids would go around, and a handful of kids would put money in the bank. The whole school would stop. They had a release day for religion. The schedule made no sense. I mean, so there's an illogic that you kind of, because in education it kind of grows, the schedule grows. We go from September to June as if kids still work on farms, for example. So I say that we juxtapose the illogic with the joy. Somehow, as you know, when that door closes, and we don't close them anymore, but when you have your class and you see kids obviously learning something for the first time or reacting or whatever, it really is a joy. So I think that's what eventually came through, I hope.
So much of what you did was go against resistance to change. It seemed like every step you turned, whether you were a new teacher, when you were a superintendent, or even before that, people just didn't want, in Melrose, they didn't want to have any change. They didn't want to close a school to see how that might improve the town as a whole. Yet you're a change maker today, clearly. How were you able to rise above that?
It's interesting, and I really didn't see this as a particular skill until after I read the book and read it, and wrote the book and then read it. And I said, wow. And it reminds me of a story. My brother was editor of the Boston Globe, which is mentioned in there. And he decided one time that he was going to include for the columnist a stipple, which is a drawing. Yeah. And so I remember he included Mike Barnacle, and so there was a little drawing of him. Well, people went nuts. They didn't think it looked like him, and it was just this big furor. And so he let it die down, and then every once in a while he'd throw a picture in of this columnist and that. And now, as you know, it's commonplace.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I think what you have to do is recognize that people are very sincere in their opposition. You can't be disrespectful. And here I was with MCAS. And people were convinced that we were going to be denying diplomas to poor kids that deserved it. And I thought the opposite. I mean, I think it was proven to be. But you can't disrespect that. And so I tried very hard not to argue, but to try and move it from the discussion of what we were denying to what we were trying to accomplish, which was to make sure kids had skills as they left high schools. Because business was telling us, look, you're giving them high school diplomas, but they don't know anything. And so somehow it's that ability to be respectful, even though you disagree, and be very clear that you are going to uphold the law in this particular case. And so you have to be very definite, but at the same time, be open enough to at least listen.
Yeah, I think the thing that hits me all the time is expectations. Because in the very beginning of the book, you talk about these kids in these classrooms and study halls and whatever with expectations down here. And would you like to speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, and in fact, I talk about my master's thesis. Professor Ilvaseeker at Tufts had developed this juvenile delinquency proneness test. Awful thing. And so I gave it to my students in my class, which was 3A, the best kids in the school. And then I gave it to my homeroom, which was 3H. And it came out a statistically huge, significant difference in the proneness of the 3H kids to go towards juvenile delinquency as defined. And so what it amounted to was, do you do your homework? Do you study? Do you stay home at night? Do you get good sleep? Do you all that? All the 3A, all those kids had all those good habits, and that was their expectation. I actually had a student in Somerville whose older sister went to, two older sisters went to four-year colleges in the Boston area. She started out as a good student. Halfway through the year, she was not doing her homework, so forth and so on. I had the mother come in. Turned out the father had died, and the new husband didn't care anything about education and had money and spoiled her, according to the mother. And so that child's whole academic career changed because of the expectations. So we see it all the time. So I think it's so important that we have high expectations for young people.
David, I want to take a step back. I want you to tell me a little bit more about your upbringing, how it kind of made you the person you are. I know you're one of 10 children.
Correct, youngest.
And you talk, the youngest of 10. You talk a lot about your mom in the early stages of this book and living with her and your early years as a teacher. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so it was unique. I was the youngest of 10. Not only the youngest of 10, but there's 8 years between my brother Jack and I. So my older brothers and sisters were quite a bit older than I. Many of them have now passed away, and they had fought in World War II, et cetera. So I had this generational change where I was here with my current generation, which was, growing up in the 60s. And then I had my brothers and sisters, of course, who were that much older. So I got a glimpse. So I think we're all, as we talk about in education, it's environment and heredity. Those are two very important factors. And in my case, it was really an advantage. Even though we were poor, as I say in the book, we knew we had to go to college. We knew we didn't have any money, but we were going to college. And my mother took herself down to the local priest who happened to have a scholarship to Boston College. That's how I happened to go there. So there were a lot of advantages I have in being the youngest of 10 and watching not only my 9 siblings, but my 37 nieces and nephews, a couple of them that are just a couple of years younger than I. All of those family experiences helped.
Did they help with your sense of humor?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You have to have a sense of humor in a big family.
Now, you were a math major at BC, but eventually you transitioned to education, and you never looked back. Not everybody goes into education and stays as a teacher. In your case, you went in the direction of administration. Why did you make that turn?
Well, let's start with why I went into education to begin
Sounds
with.
good.
I mean,
Sure.
The last thing I wanted to do was go into teaching, because when I was a math major at Boston College, computers were just coming in. And we all knew we were going to be rich. And in fact, most of my classmates at Boston College that were math majors did very well in the private industry. So that's where I was going. Priest came on the playground when I was working in the summer and convinced me to teach Sunday school. And I fell in love with teaching. So it was the last thing that I wanted to do was to become a teacher. And then I fell in love with it and went in to it not the usual way. I had to take courses in a different way. With administration, I also didn't want to be an administrator particularly. I love teaching. But the more I got involved in issues, and I got involved even in Somerville, I organized the faculty because I was so upset by the illogic, and no one else seemed to care. And they'd complain about it in the teacher's room, but then I'd say, well, why don't we do something about it? Well, you know. So I organized the faculty even there. So I wound up, and then I worked on a referendum in Melrose to get a new high school. And I don't know, it just, you know, I became addicted to want to make a difference. And so that drives you to want to be an administrator where you can make more of a difference than a classroom teacher can.
And just one follow-up with that. In terms of the politics of education, because a lot of the position that you had, not just as superintendent, but as you moved on up, became really a political type job with education. How do you find that balance between making sure that you have the support of any kind of political folks, but then also making sure that the kids were first, the teachers were first with education?
It's something that you have to remind yourself. I mean, there are too many people that fall into one category or another. They're very good at educational policy and that kind of thing, but they're not very good at the politics, and that'll really do you in. I can think of a former commissioner in Massachusetts, terrific guy, and he just was done in by the politics. I mean, he didn't see it. He couldn't see it. On the other hand, you know, you can't just be a political, you have to stand up at times. You can't just go with the flow all the time. So it's that balance. And I was fortunate, I think Bob Antonucci, who recruited me as a deputy, had those skills. And so I learned from him, but I also had them myself. So it worked.
Yeah, your early conversations in here with talking about the students, and then you went back to your school in Somerville, and it was interesting. It wasn't your students that were so excited to see you.
Exactly right. So it turned out when I went back to the school for a social event, I had a unique car in those days because I didn't have any money, so I had an old car, and everybody knew, the kids all knew the car. So I had left, so this was the year after I had left, so I came back and I hadn't seen the kids. This was the spring, so it was a whole school year. And as I drove down the street, you know, it was a big school with a lot of kids coming out, and I saw some of my better students, and they kind of waved, and they were happy, they waved. But the kids from my homeroom and others that, you know, had a little bit more difficulty, they almost ran out into the street. It was really interesting. And, you know, I don't, for the kids that had done well, that was fine because that was my job, was to just help them. They were going to succeed, and I was a helpful agent along the way. To the kids who really need it, I was kind of an oasis from there. No one, you know, built them up. I tried to build up those kids and talk about, find something that they're good at, et cetera. So, yeah, it was an interesting experience for me because I wasn't expecting it.
Well, we have much more to hear from former Commissioner David Driscoll, and we'll go into that as soon as we get back. Stay with us.
I've always wanted to go to college. That helps you evolve as a person. I just feel like that's my destiny. My name is Queen, and I am your dividend.
Morning, Gary. We are GetSchooled.com. You want a college education, don't you?
You know you do. Yeah, but I don't know where to start.
That's why we're here. We're free, handsome,
Oh, I think we're breathtaking.
and here to guide you through every step of the way, starting with attendance. Gary, financial aid forms. Biology homework, G. I got this. Is that Bran? Colleges love extracurricular activities.
Chess really isn't my thing.
I got this. Doesn't matter. Go ahead. Picking a college, man. You and us go together like tacos and Tuesday.
And I love tacos.
Fire and ice.
Those don't really go together.
Go to GetSchooled.com for more info.
Welcome back to Novel Ideas. We're here this evening with David Driscoll, our former Commissioner of Education, talking about his book, Commitment and Common Sense. So, David, would you like to fill us in a little bit more about how all of this speaks to ed reform and the historical part of this book?
Well, it was very interesting. Massachusetts, as we all know, has a very proud history. We're first in a lot of things. The first public school in America, the first college, etc. So we've always had a prominent place in public education as well as private education. And for years, we heard about ed reform, and different states would do different things. And Sputnik came along, and then A Nation at Risk really was the driving force behind standards-based education reform. And Kentucky actually was a state ahead of us in that regard. And then it came to us here in Massachusetts, and the leadership, both of the business community in particular, but also governors and legislators were frustrated because they had tried different reforms. And it really was, as described in the book, Jack Rennie of the Mass Business Alliance for Education that was the catalyst. A lot of people deserve credit, including the governors and speakers of the House and Senate presidents and others. But Jack was the catalyst to put it together, to write a report called Every Child a Winner, and to set the framework for education reform here in Massachusetts, which was about higher standards and expectations for students, for teachers, and for schools and districts. And he struck what he called the grand bargain. He used to say, everybody has to drink a little castor oil. And so principals, for example, under the new law were able to pick their own teachers, which was very good, but they lost tenure. So, there was money for education, sizable amount of money to bring people up to a foundation level, but there was the accountability, and so there was the graduation requirement, which was required in law. So it was quite a tremendous piece of legislation, and well thought out. I called it a beautiful thing. The Massachusetts Education Reform Act, a beautiful thing. So, but then it was up to us to implement it, and that's where often laws fall short. They sound good, they look good on paper, but they don't get implemented well and fall apart often.
Well, a chunk of the implementation required money. How did the money come about?
Well, we were very fortunate that a conservative Republican governor, Bill Weld, agreed with Jack Rennie and the Business Alliance that if we were going to be serious, money had to be part of the mix. That we had these, and by the way, we had a lawsuit pending because cities like Holyoke and Lawrence and what we call now the gateway cities had huge class sizes, inadequate buildings, inadequate supplies, and so forth. So Jack was convinced money had to be part of the picture. Now, what Bill Weld said was, we'll provide extra money, $300 million additional money each year for 7 years was the plan, but we're going to do it without raising taxes, and we did. I mean, it was a very fortunate time that the economy was booming, and so it was a remarkable commitment. But so after the 7 years, all districts were up to foundation.
On a personal level, I was a teacher in Massachusetts for 3 years, and that's actually how I know Carol. I'm not even sure our viewers know the story, or if they do, it's worth repeating, but this makes me feel a little bit old to tell you that I taught Carol's daughter in 6th grade, and she's now an optometrist. But at the same time, that's what happened. And I was under your Department of Education when I first got there. It was in 1999. And the program that I was in, the signing bonus program for new teachers, or whatever you want to call it, was to cultivate kind of that program. And that was one of those programs that got a lot of pushback from veteran teachers that saw us as kind of invading the space of not having a lot of experience in what we'd done before. And yet it seems like innovative program after innovative program that you guys did, you eventually got these things through, and people eventually bought in. How were you able to pull that off?
Well, again, in looking back at the book,
Yeah.
after I wrote it,
Yeah.
I learned some things in rereading it. And one of those that I find myself having been in a kind of a unique position. I did not come through the usual avenues to become a teacher.
Right. I think that's
And so I didn't I didn't have this loyalty to the system the way some people do. They, as I say, the other teachers just kind of ignore the logic. They say, that's the way it is. So I sit in a place that says the system has to change. We're not doing what we ought to be doing. Kids aren't engaged. For example, high school kids have reported now for decades that their number one complaint, they don't like the food, they don't like cliques and bullying now, etc. But their number one complaint, they're bored and they see no connection between what they're learning and what they need in real life. So to me, the system has to change. You can't just sit there and say, well, this is just the way it is, it's the parents' fault or whatever. On the other hand, I'm not a basher of the system either. I think it's wonderful what goes on. Our problem is that we don't often replicate it. I can take you anywhere in this country, anywhere in this Commonwealth, into schools, and you will see wonderful teachers doing great things everywhere. Mm-hmm. The problem is it doesn't necessarily go to scale. And that's something we have to work on, as far as I'm concerned, in the system. So that's what I tried to do. You talked about that teacher quality program, of which the bonus was one. And the system doesn't necessarily embrace change. Look at the controversy around charter schools. I mean, you want to start a battle,
Sure.
you don't even have to mention President Trump. You just talk about charter schools in
That's right.
Massachusetts, you're going to start a battle.
Yeah.
And so I tried very hard to recognize, I mean, if you think about what charter schools have accomplished here in the Commonwealth, in Boston, and across the country, but here in Massachusetts, we have the best charter schools in the country by student achievement. And we have these tremendous waiting lists of people that want to get into charter schools. And we have charter schools in certain communities that have high percentages of kids going on to college. And in the community itself, it's less than 50%. So there's something to be said for charter schools. On the other hand, they're not the total answer. So it's being in that middle that allowed me to not get caught in one camp or the other, but to move the ball forward. So yes, there were veteran teachers that didn't like the bonus program, but guess what? We brought people into education that wouldn't have been there before, similar to a Teach for America program. Yep. And it helped kids, and it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, there seems to be so much of a nice sense of balance. I don't know if this is your mathematical background or what, but so many places in the book, it's not like there's a magic bullet and we're going for that magic bullet. How did you keep from getting sidetracked by magic bullets like
Yeah, so I think that is my
like
nature. You know, I'm a Libra, and maybe the others of 10 helped. But I do see, I try to see balance, maybe the mathematical equational part of things. But I think that's right. And so, for example, the graduation requirement was one of the most charged political issues that we've seen in the Commonwealth. I mean, people just were beside themselves that we were going to actually deny diplomas. I mean, people tried to delay it, defer it. There were some school committees that said they weren't going to allow their teachers to do it. And I had to tell them that we're going to take the teachers' licenses away because it's a violation of the law. So it was just crazy, very emotional, but we stuck with it. So once people realized, look, this is going to happen, it was very interesting. Everybody shifted from trying to do away with the graduation requirement to trying to help the kids get over the bar, which is exactly what we wanted. So we saw tutoring programs, and as you know, it was an 8th grade standard at the 10th grade level, and pretty soon 90% and more were passing. And in fact, parents in the urban areas that everybody thought would be most affected and against us were the ones that said, this is great, kids are finally paying attention to my kids and to my children. And so, so it is that balance. One other story. So we were going to give the graduation requirement, that was it. So now people realized it. And so we said, well, how do we make it better? How do we deal with kids that are that are test phobic? How do we deal with ELL kids and special ed kids and kids who honestly can't pass, but we should do something for them at graduation. And so we put groups of people together that represented all those groups and came up with a number of things that are in the book that made a lot of sense. So, for example, on the kids who just freeze up on tests, if they could show that they performed at the level as other kids that had passed, if they get the same kind of grades as other people had passed, and we did a statistical analysis, then that meant they were performing, which is what we wanted. And so we had an appeal process, and they were able to do it. So I think it's that being open while everybody gets emotional to try and say, wait a minute, here's what's going to happen because this is the law, but let's see if we can't mitigate some of this emotion and figure out how to work together. And it worked.
Yeah, now, David, you have done a fabulous job with this whole ed reform of bringing the kids up from the bottom. But what about the kids that are way up at the top, the ones that start school that already know 90% of what they're going to be taught that year? Where does that leave them?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And I talk in the book about sameness and difference, trying to celebrate sameness and difference. And so we want all kids to know their basic facts, et cetera. But we also want kids to be able to enjoy art or music or culinary arts or welding or whatever. So you're absolutely right about those kids. And I think we have not done as well with, as some people like to call the gifted and talented kids, et cetera. And I think that what we need to do is engage kids and more than we do. And these kids need other opportunities. And by the way, we haven't done as good a job in closing the gap either. I mean, all boats rose, but those needy kids still are lacking. So there are holes almost everywhere. And I think that's right. The MCAS graduation was a floor, not a ceiling. And we need to pay more attention to the ceiling, more attention to the kids that are proficient and advanced and need individual need to have a celebration of their individual talents.
We could go on all night. I have one final question for you before we wrap up. You've had a long and distinguished career. Is there one achievement that you would describe as a crowning achievement, the one that you think about when you consider all that you've done?
Well, the one today, because I was talking to Carol earlier, was that I was a gifted and talented Odyssey of the Mind coach as superintendent of schools. So I had a co-coach because I was superintendent of schools. I didn't have the kind of time. But we had a team. My daughter was on a high school team, and we won the state championship in Odyssey of the Mind and went to the nationals at the University of Tennessee. And so that was a remarkable. The kids deserve all the credit, believe me. But that was a great achievement, and I learned a lot about kids who we leave behind in the school systems because they are different. They have different. They run deep sometimes. They have inquisitive minds sometimes. They're impatient, and the system isn't geared for them. And Odyssey of the Mind gives them an opportunity to show their talents. So I'll stick with that one today.
It's a great program.
Okay.
I was the judge. I love it, absolutely. David Driscoll, thank you so much. Commitment and Common Sense is his book, and you can get this anywhere, Amazon, bookstores as well.
If I can, if anybody
Please.
wants to email me,
Yeah.
it's driscollconsulting@yahoo.com. 2 L's, driscollconsulting@yahoo.com. I can give them a code at Harvard Education Press that'll save them 20%.
Perfect.
So,
Love it.
Oh, thank you so much for being with us, David.
Well, thank
it's been
you.
delightful having you on the show. And thank you to Access Framingham for making this program possible. Thank you to our viewers and my co-host here. It's been a wonderful time.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.